In this video, we will be covering the largest Roman iceberg I've ever seen. And in the first video, we covered the first two tiers of the iceberg, which went over a few of the basic things, the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic. But in this video, we will start to delve into the lesser known ideas, the stranger theories about ancient Rome, some emperors and rules and laws and events that very few people know. I'm still trying to figure out the camera angles on this set, so forgive me for that. But grab a drink. My choice today is warm milk with honey, and join me as we explore the ultimate Roman iceberg. The Gracchi brothers actually ties into something we just covered in the previous video, the Punic Wars. So during the Second Punic War, a key player in the political and military maneuvers was a man named Scipio Africanus, who was both a Roman general and politician. So you've got Scipio here. His daughter was a woman named Cornelia, and she was the mother to the Gracchi brothers. So these two brothers were basically Scipio's grandchildren. And Scipio was a very intelligent man, fantastic at politics, fantastic at battle maneuvers, and so was his daughter Cornelia and also his grandchildren. And Cornelia made it a point to raise her children to be kind, wise, intelligent, thinking, and partly because they were raised so well, Tiberius, one of the brothers, was elected consul in 133 BC, and he was assassinated just a year later. And his brother Gaius was also elected consul 10 years after Tiberius was elected, and he actually served 2 terms as consul until there was a public unrest, the Senate declared martial law, and soon after killed Gaius and prosecuted his closest allies. So, why did the Senate do this? Well, these brothers were very interesting individuals. They had planned a lot of reforms, some quite interesting reforms, and planned to, for one, take a bunch of state land, land actually owned by Rome itself, and mostly give it away to poor people to start farms, to build houses, basically giving back to the people, and to expand Roman land to colonies outside of Italy, for one, and to set up legal protection for citizens, making sure Romans had access to cheap grain, and just in general kind of flip the power over from the Senate and the rich, well-to-do people into the hands of basically the common man of Rome. And it was really for this that they were both killed. And this is just one example of the rampant corruption in Rome at the time. There were some very, very rich businessmen, property and land owners, and naturally they would often bribe people, they would pay off politicians to be in their good books, and basically hand select senators and people to put into power, and then those senators would then work in that rich person's interests. And as we mentioned before, this corruption is at least in part what led to the eventual downfall of the Republic just about 100 years after this. Ab urbe condita. Here is a question. How do you measure what year it is? Now, most people would say 2025 AD, or CE if you're very modern. And these stand for, obviously, CE being Common Era, or AD meaning Anno Domini, which is Latin for the Lord's Year. Both of these terms start from basically the same year, and that is 0, with the birth of Christ. So 5 years after the birth of Christ is 5 AD, 100 years after is 100 AD, but that begs the question, what did the people in the years of BC, so before the birth of Christ, what year did they say it was? And that's a little tricky. Most people kind of had their own system. Most people around the world, most cultures kind of had their own measurements. But the Roman system and the Roman tagline was something called ab urbe condita, which is Latin for at the founding of the city, meaning Rome. So all throughout Roman archaeology, taglines in coins engraved into buildings and stone, and written down is the tagline ab urbe condita, or AUC in reference to the year. And this year, in our system, this year of the founding of the city of Rome was the year 753 BC, which the Romans obviously called the year 0. And so this is how we're kind of able to translate the times and the years of what happened then into our more modern system. So if there was a great event or war or battle or something that took place in the year 456 AUC, that would actually be 298 BC in our system. Commodus. Oh boy. Commodus. What do we have to say about this guy? Well, he was the son and successor of Marcus Aurelius, who, as you might recall, is one of the 5 noble or good emperors. And Commodus was a very different ruler to his father. His father was and is well known for being quite reserved, quite sensible, quite stoic, not letting his emotions come into play too much. He was wise, strong, smart, sensible, but Commodus, on the other hand? Well, I mean, for a start, obviously he wasn't a good emperor because he ruled just after the 5 good emperors. And so if he were a good emperor, he would just be the 6th good emperor, and so the list would just be the 6 good emperors. But he started his rule off at the age of 18 when Marcus Aurelius died, and he ruled for around about 12 years, and in these 12 years, he did some insane stuff. He was quite mercurial as an individual. He would often, if he just didn't like someone, just sentence them to death. You know, no waiting around, no trial, just like, boom, dead. He generally, as a rule, kind of disliked the Senate, and he often sided more with the common person, with the worker or the soldier, and he would put on these huge grand shows, these gladiator events, often with money that he got from taxing the Senate, which is a little hilarious. And again, in contrast with his calm, reserved, stoic father, he himself would often take place in these gladiatorial events, which the fights were obviously rigged, but the Senate, the rich people, the well-to-do people, they again thought this was quite unbecoming of an emperor. It'd be like Obama fighting in the WWE or something, you know, while he was in office. Actually, that doesn't sound like such a bad idea. And this all isn't even the craziest part. He renamed the months of the year after his own names. He renamed the legions after himself, calling them the Commodianae or Commodianae. He renamed the Senate the Commodian Fortunate Senate. He often dressed himself up as Hercules and generally saw himself as a god. And he saw himself as the initial kind of new Romulus, you know, the founder of Rome. And so he also renamed Rome after himself, being the Colonia Lucia Annia Commodoria, or the Colonia Commodiana for short, meaning the colony of Commodus. And he was also the emperor in Gladiator, you know, with Maximus, this guy right here. So now you know. Antonine's Wall was the lesser known brother of Hadrian's Wall, and after Hadrian built his wall, you know, in northern England / Scotland, Antoninus Pius, who we covered earlier, one of the 5 good emperors, he sought to kind of further strengthen this wall to solidify the divide between the barbarians in the north and the already conquered southern Britannia by essentially not really fortifying Hadrian's Wall, but by building another wall further north. And this wall, I think, was a bit ambitious. It didn't last for nearly as long as Hadrian's Wall did. Like, I think they pushed a little too far north. They weren't able to hold the land. And it was roughly the same kind of size as Hadrian's Wall, just in terms of the height and the width of it. But lengthwise, it was around half the length of Hadrian's Wall. And it was built in 142 AD, kind of shortly after Hadrian's Wall, but was only used for around 20 years before being abandoned, whereas Hadrian's Wall stayed in use for roughly 300 years. And just as a side note, this is the length of Antonine's Wall, this is the length of Hadrian's Wall, and this, holy cow, is the length of the Great Wall of China, which in comparison is just the mother of all walls. The crisis of the 3rd century. So this was a really rocky period for the Roman Empire that stemmed really from an entire series of problems. Firstly, the Roman Empire was huge at this point, and it was constantly being attacked and raided from all over Europe. You know, that includes Middle Europe like France and Germany, also Britannia, also Spain, North Africa, Asia, the Mediterranean, and this all naturally cost resources. 2, the actual military themselves had gotten to a point where they were really super powerful, and they would only support a leader that basically paid them money. So it was kind of close to a mafia sort of thing, which that's pretty rich. Of course it would be mafia coming from Italy. But basically anyone who got into power and wanted to cut this money from going to the military, they just wouldn't get anywhere close to being in power. And if you didn't pay up, maybe the military wouldn't listen to you. Maybe there would be a coup or assassination or something. And this money and these payments every year was just getting more and more and more. And partly due to this increased spending on the military, or, you know, in the form of like bribes and backhanders, combined with the fact that the empire was making less and less money, the currency was being constantly debased, which basically led to more and more inflation. So on paper, they were able to pay for things, they had this money, but the money itself was constantly worth less and less. And new emperors at the time would often kind of do this with their coins. So say you're paid 10 coins a day, and each coin is worth $1, just for example. Well, when the new emperor would come in order to maybe pay for things, he could reduce the amount of gold in each coin by like 10%. So even though you're still being paid 10 coins, these 10 coins are now worth $9 instead of $10. 4, the question of succession was kind of a little murky. The Roman kingdom would have a senate vote in a king for life. In later European kingdoms, succession often went to their heir. So, you know, the closest male blood relative, like a son or a nephew or something. And the Republic was heavily senate-based. The consuls would be voted into power. But with the empire, it wasn't really so clear. And I think part of the reason for that is that they were kind of walking between political systems. Like, this was an empire that still had a senate, it still had kind of some votes, and most emperors didn't want this to come off like a dictatorship, or God forbid, a kingdom, which is, I think, probably why they still kept the senate around. So it was like, yeah, this is kind of like the old republic, but also kind of like a kingdom, but also like a dictatorship or an empire. And this at the time helped feed into the chaos, because if an emperor died, for example, it's like, would his son come into power, or would the senate pick someone? Would perhaps the people pick someone, you know, someone that was popular with the people? Or could the military and the army at the time just strongman any decision, threaten to kill anyone that got put into power who they didn't pick? And this is a question that a lot of powerful people at the time debated, and they debated with swords and assassinations and coups. And so that's the whole background of this general crisis. And this whole thing started when Emperor Severus Alexander, who was at the time fighting off invasions in the east, he then went over to the west side of the empire, where these Germanic tribes had been, you know, attacking the empire for years. And instead of fighting back against them, instead of killing them or invading them or something, he decided to basically make a deal of diplomacy on the promise that they would stop attacking Rome. And this one decision instantly made him incredibly unpopular with his soldiers, because it was like, these barbarians have been attacking and bullying us for years, and then there was no retribution, no revenge. It was just like, oh, we'll just set up a truce. And so his soldiers murdered him, and they declared the commander of one of their legions the new emperor. And Maximinus Thrax was his name, and he served for only around 3 years before also being assassinated by his own troops. The Senate, as you can imagine, weren't too pleased with this. It was crazy, it was chaotic, and with the death of Maximinus, there were many people vying to be emperor and trying to take control and power. And this actually led to the breaking up of the empire. Different rulers and commanders from all different parts of the empire basically seceded, like what happened with America during the Civil War, and the Roman areas of Britain and Western Europe became the Gallic Empire, and the Roman areas of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, more or less, became the Palmyrene Empire. And no one was really budging. And this whole period really shouldn't be understated for how dire it was. Like, it very well could have led to the end of the empire as they knew it, and the formation and building up of these other empires, the Gallic one, the Palmyrene one. And on top of all of this infighting and civil wars and inflation and food shortages and bloody plagues, the issue of outside invaders and attackers never went away. So while you're dealing with this all within the Roman Empire, you're still having to defend your borders against the barbarians. And it could be argued that the barbarians actually ramped up their attacks because they started to, smell the blood on the water. They started to see how chaotic and potentially broken apart the Roman Empire was becoming. And it's really crazy if you look at the timeline of rulers at this time, because it's like one guy rules for like 100 days and then he's assassinated, and then another person rules for like 3 weeks and then he's also assassinated, and then another guy for 2 months and then he dies. And this sort of thing just went on and on and on during this period. I mean, honestly, look at this list of emperors. And this was in really just a few years. And it wasn't until an emperor named Aurelian came in. He defeated the Goths and the Vandals, and he defeated the once Roman Palmyrene Empire, and then he defeated the Gallic Empire. And with this, he basically reunited Rome. He built the Aurelian walls, these huge walls around Rome to protect it, and he made some great changes to the government, to the economy of Rome, which, I mean, definitely helped out until he was assassinated just 5 years later. And then there was another string of kind of short-lived rulers until an emperor named Diocletian came into power, who he himself was actually what was called a barracks emperor, which was an emperor chosen by the military people, chosen by the soldiers, and then kind of forced in. He kind of forced his way in with the military, so kind of like a military coup, but then while he was in power, he worked towards stopping that. So he was kind of a noble ruler in a way. He forced his way into power, but then didn't turn it into a permanent dictatorship. He actually made reforms and worked towards spreading out the power and making sure a military coup would never happen in the future. So a very interesting fellow. And I don't want to get into everything he did because it is a very long list, but in general, his reforms worked at spreading out the power more evenly, giving multiple people control, maybe kind of like governors in America, and making sure the military was both well funded, but also well heard and well respected, but also didn't give them so much power that they would just coup the new leader every couple of years. And he also really tried to integrate religion into society, because he thought if the Roman Empire had kind of one unifying religion, that you wouldn't get so much infighting, everyone would be on the same side, on the same team, and it was a very rough period that very well could have been the end of the Roman Empire. Tier 4, the conquest of Gaul genocide, refers obviously to the conquest of Gaul, so this whole area, and asks the question whether or not this was actually a genocide. And there are kind of mixed opinions on this, with most people agreeing that it was incredibly brutal, it was a bloody time during the invasion, lots of battles, lots of deaths, but there are differing opinions on whether or not this was a genocide, with one side saying yes, it was war, and wars and battles are most of the time going to be extremely messy, violent, bloody, and this whole killing and enslaving by Rome was just the result of Rome wanting to defend and then expand its borders to move into other lands, but really nothing more. Whereas the other side believes that an actual literal genocide took place, and that Julius Caesar really went into Gaul with the express purpose of, invading, killing as many people as possible, wiping out entire groups and ethnicities of these people, taking their land, destroying their culture, etc. And let me know which side of the fence you sit on. And it really was pretty insane. There was an estimated roughly like 3 million Gauls living in this area, and Julius Caesar himself said that the Romans had killed roughly 1 million and enslaved 1 million more, meaning that according to some sources, 2/3 of the population was either killed or enslaved. But there are later estimations and different sources that put the population of Gaul at the time around 10 or 12 million, and maybe Julius Caesar exaggerated some of his numbers, so it's possible instead that maybe he killed like 7 to 10% of the population, which is still a lot, don't get me wrong, but I think it makes for less of an argument for genocide than killing and enslaving 2/3 of the population. So if you ask me, probably not a genocide, but still one hell of a brutal time. The heating system. So for anyone who's in England or has visited England or will visit England, a great place to see this actually in action is in the city of Bath. And there you can actually see a lot of the ancient Roman baths that were built, and along with them you can see their underfloor heating systems. And they are really quite sophisticated. The system they used was something called a hypocaust, and as opposed to having just like one source of heat, you know, like maybe a furnace or a fire on one side of the room, they instead built something akin to like the world's first central heating system. And so in your house, if you've got central heating, there's typically like a boiler or something in one part of the house, and then it pumps water, you know, through pipes, through radiators, and this one source can basically heat up the entire house. And in this Roman system, you would have these tiles kind of stacked up, and then the floors would be placed on top of them. And so underneath the floors of these buildings, you would have this entire airflow system into which hot air was pumped. So imagine a giant fire furnace or something over here, and it is just constantly emitting heat. This heat is pumped through these floors, even up into walls, as certain gaps were built around the walls. And so when you'd come into this bathhouse, this bathroom, the walls would be hot, the floors would be hot, and this heat would then radiate into the rooms. So it is a super cool system to see. And as I said, if you're able to go visit the city of Bath, I would absolutely recommend it. But this is just another example of the Romans being very far ahead of their time. Romulus and Remus. So this, I think, is a somewhat well-known one, and this was basically the foundation story or myth of the founding of Rome. And so as the legend goes, Romulus and Remus were two twins who were born of Rhea Silvia and Mars, the god of war. And the details behind this myth are incredibly fascinating. Rhea's father was a king who basically had his throne stolen from him, or at least had his right to the throne stolen from him. And this was by his brother Amulius, who then became king. So, since Amulius didn't want any male heirs to be born from Rhea, you know, because they could threaten the throne, threaten his reign, he chose not to kill her, but instead forced her to become what's called a Vestal Virgin. And Vestal Virgins were kind of like a nun in a way. They looked after and kept lit the flame of Vesta, which apparently helped protect the city, and they also swore a vow of celibacy. And in return for their devotion, these ladies were often given quite a few privileges. They had the right to vote, the right to own property, they got special seats at some of the public games and shows, and as soon as they made their vows, they passed from the protection of their father to the protection of the state, meaning that in a weird way the state was like their father. And so if you can imagine every citizen as being the child of the state, this meant that any sexual relations between citizens and between these Vestal Virgins was actually seen in a strange way as being incestuous. So yeah, pretty strange. The Vestal Virgins' bodies were seen as being incredibly, you know, holy in a way, and so harming or killing these virgins was punishable by death. And if the Vestal Virgins broke their vows, they were also punished quite harshly. If they failed to upkeep the sacred flame, for example, they were brutally whipped. Or if they broke their vow of celibacy, they were then buried alive. So it seemed to be a fairly lovely job, just as long as you stuck to the rules. But this was Amulius's way of not killing Rhea, but also making sure that she never had kids that could question his rule. But according to the legend, one night Mars came down, Mars the god, not the planet, but he came down and forced himself upon Rhea. And 9 months later, she gave birth to twins, Romulus and Remus. Amulius then found out about this. He ordered Rhea and her 2 twins killed. But the guy that Amulius sent out to do the killing, he kind of took pity on the 2 boys, and instead of killing them, he pushed them down the Tiber River, and they floated down the river until they were eventually found and raised by a wolf. And this she-wolf apparently looked after them, cared for them, fed them, and then eventually they were found and raised properly by a shepherd and his wife. And so they were kind of disguised at this point. They grew up in relative peace until eventually they found out about their birthright and their grandfather, and they overthrew Amulius and got Numitor back his throne. So then the 2 boys decided to go off and found their own city, but they couldn't quite decide where to put it. It was either on Aventine Hill or Palatine Hill, and so because they couldn't come to an agreement, they couldn't decide which hill to start it on, they decided to seek out God's favor through a contest of augury. And augury is a practice of basically observing birds' behavior, which I don't know why they couldn't have done rock, paper, scissors or something, or played a 1v1 on Rust, you know, like how proper disputes are settled. But during this contest, Remus said he saw 6 special birds, while Romulus said, actually, I saw 12 special birds, so therefore I'm the winner, which means apparently that he won the favor of God. But then Remus was basically like, no, this competition's stupid, you're still in the wrong. They had a fight about it afterwards, and during this fight, Romulus ended up killing Remus, and so Romulus won anyway, and he founded the city of Rome on Palatine Hill. And obviously the name Rome comes from his own name being Romulus. And I quite love all of these ancient myths, you know, these origin stories, these foundational tales. And whether or not it happened, it's definitely something that the Romans believed, and it was kind of threaded into their culture. They passed it down from generation to generation, with Romulus apparently ruling as the first king of Rome for around about 40 years. Constantinople. So we did already touch on the Eastern Roman Empire with Constantinople, etc. But this is more a look at the founding of the city and the origin of this city. And now it's called Istanbul. Before that, it was named Constantinople after Constantine the Great. And before that, it was named Byzantium, which was this ancient Greek city that might have potentially got its name from Byzas, meaning he-goat, which is a very strange superhero name. But the city was probably founded in around 700 BC, and the placement of it, the positioning of it, is really quite strategic, which might explain why it became such an important city in the year 300 AD, with Emperor Constantine making Byzantium the new capital of Rome, and obviously naming it after himself, from Byzantium to Constantinople. This word, the assault of the Sabines. So I'm sure you can guess the actual word, but this was an event that took place in the early days of Rome, kind of just after its founding. And when it was founded, they seemingly had a distinct lack of females. And so Romulus, the king at the time, was afraid that they weren't going to be able to sustain an entire population. They had just fought for and founded this great city, and then maybe in a few generations, their population would have declined. They would have been taken over or died out or something. And so Romulus devised a plan. And this plan was that he would go out with all of his people to the surrounding cities around Rome, and they would find women out there. They would talk to them, try and schmooze them a little bit, and convince them to come back to Rome. And then they could start families, etc., you know, the birds and the bees. But apparently they had very little luck in either convincing the women to come over or convincing the men to allow the women to come over. So they devised another plan, and that was to arrange these great games in Rome. You know, these games would be the greatest games ever, and because they were so great, all of these people from all of these surrounding cities wouldn't be able to help themselves in coming down and participating in the games. And this was during the festival of Neptune Equester. And when these games took place, when all of these people were gathered here, at the drop of a hat, at a certain signal, all of these Roman guards and Roman men would basically like attack the other men and then take and steal all of their females, which is a little unsavory. But this word, which I'm sure you can guess what word it is by now, this actually comes from the Latin word being raptio. And this means to abduct or take or steal. And so it wasn't necessarily sexual, but over the years, basically when this word raptio was used in relation to women, it was pretty much always thought or implied to be sexual. And so with the, word of these Sabines, you can think of this less like taking them there and assaulting them, on the spot, and more probably like a kidnapping or stealing, with obviously probably assaulting actually taking place, but maybe at a later date in a different area, maybe after marriage, something like that. And eventually the Sabines and various other cities around the time, they all fought the Romans. There were many wars and battles, etc. that took place. Many people died. It was a wild time, but eventually a peace was made. Rome got to keep their wives, their newly acquired women, and this seemed to help with the population problem that Rome had at the time. And yeah, this was all the way back when Rome was just this tiny little city, so a very different time. Roman Hibernia. So before we get into a history lesson here, we need to quickly have an etymological or language lesson. And Hibernia was basically the Roman name for Ireland. And we're not 100% sure where the name actually comes from, but it was likely derived from what the local Irish people called it at the time, which was something like Iweriu, and this was adapted to something like Ian, which is what the Greek explorer Pytheas called it all the way back in 325 BC. And after a while, the Romans eventually called it Hibernia. And this was likely by taking iron and adding IA onto the end of it, as the Romans like to do with, foreign place names like Gallia and Britannia and Italia, and they added an H onto the start of it, as again they like to do with foreign place names that started with a vowel. So you have Hispania became Hispania, you have the Hellenes became the Hellenes for Greece, and so Iweriu became probably something like Ian, became Ionia, Hiernia, and then Hibernia. Not necessarily in that order or steps, but that was the rough evolution of the name. And as for Ireland itself, it was never actually conquered, invaded, settled, or anything by Rome. There are some Roman coins and artifacts, etc. found in Ireland, but these are thought to be solely from trade, because the Irish themselves did actually, sail over to Britain, trade some stuff out, sail back over. But I guess for the Romans, they really had no need or desire to conquer Ireland. Like Britannia, England was bad enough, but this is an island that's even more grey, windy, rainy and desolate than England, and it was further away, it was across another sea. And so while Britain was quite heavily, conquered and settled, with the Romans bringing over their architecture and their roads and their culture and religion, etc., it wouldn't be until much, much later that the Britons would then indirectly bring this Roman influence over into Ireland, with obviously someone like St. Patrick, who was likely born in England or Wales, bringing over to Ireland Christianity. And as a bonus fact for this, as I'm sure you all love bonus facts, but the name Hibernia is very similar sounding to the Roman word Hibernus, which means wintry. And while it seems quite fitting that the Romans would call this tiny, cold, freezing island, that they would name it basically after a play on words for wintry, there's no real evidence to suggest that Hibernia actually came from Hibernus, or even that it was influenced by it. So it seems to be somewhat of a coincidence, but I personally think maybe it was slightly influenced, as especially for the Romans living down in the warm Mediterranean, this island must have been basically winter incarnate. The Sibylline books. And as with so many entries between these icebergs, we did cover these ones in the Legendary Artifacts iceberg, but of course I will go over them again here. But these were books of prophecy purchased by the last king of Rome, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, and this was in around the year 500 BC. And as the story goes, he was approached by a Sibyl, which was kind of like a female mystic. She saw the future, she made predictions, etc. And she offered him these 9 books of prophecy, and she offered them for a fee. And this fee was apparently super high, completely unreasonable. So Lucius said, nah, I'm alright, keep your books of prophecy. And so she went away, burnt 3 of the books, and then came back to him with the 6 remaining books and offered them for the same price. So less books, but exactly the same amount of money. And if the price was unreasonable with 9 books, it would be even more unreasonable now. And he was like, that's a little bit strange, but he turned them down again. And then she was like, all right, see what happens. Boom, 3 more books burnt. Maybe you want to buy them now, Mr. King. And he, at this point, must have known that she was kind of crazy, but whether she was good crazy or bad crazy, that was really the question. But he did eventually, at the risk of losing these books forever, he did agree to buy these 3 remaining books. And they were then kept in the sacred temple of Jupiter in Rome. Or rather, they were kept in a secret vault below the temple. But the Rome part of that statement was correct. And these were, as you can imagine, kind of similar to maybe horoscopes. They were in this Greek hexameter verse, and in times of trouble, if you didn't really know what to do, you would go in, you would read these verses, and then interpret them, and they would basically show you what to do. And they remained in this vault, super heavily guarded, hardly taken out, so no one knew exactly what was in them. And this was when they were all more or less destroyed when the temple was burnt down in the year 83 BC. So the books were kept for a fair 400 years or so. And when the books were destroyed, other new various copies of these were made, and they continued to be used until it was all eventually completely destroyed when General Flavius Stilicho ordered them to be destroyed, because I guess it was undermining his authority. People would consult with the books before making decisions instead of just listening to his orders. And as I said, we don't have any physical copies of these books, and we don't really know what exactly was written in them, because as you can imagine, if this were actually real, you wouldn't want these verses to get out anywhere or even written down in anywhere other than these highly secured books. Because if your enemies, for example, knew what was in these books and they knew how to read them, they knew what battles you were facing, they could potentially predict what you were going to do. But they were indirectly kind of referenced in Roman writings, in Roman records, which is really how we know of their existence. Tier 5, the Roman expeditions to sub-Saharan Africa. So a lot of the topics exploring Rome generally explore this area, more or less the Roman controlled lands, and that is in the Mediterranean, Europe, a bit of Asia, and a bit of Northern Africa. But Rome actually had a few expeditions that went as far south as this rough area here, so south of the Sahara. And these generally started from like the very beginning of the empire, and they did an expedition, kind of every now and then. And a somewhat interesting, somewhat offensive tidbit of information here is that the name Africa in these ancient times didn't refer to the entire continent of Africa, but rather to this kind of roughly northern area here. But when the Romans continued to explore more and more south in Africa, they developed a new name for the southern regions, that being Ethiopia, or Ethiopia. I'm not entirely sure how it was pronounced, but this comes from the Greek this word, and it's made up of the words itho or etho, meaning I burn, and ops, meaning face. So literally this area in southern Africa was the land of the burnt faces, which okay, I told you it would be offensive, but you didn't believe me. But they went down there, they went on these expeditions, mostly for resources. They were looking for, extra gold mines or other materials to mine up. They were also looking for different spices and setting up trade routes and exploration, etc. They went and explored Lake Chad, which was and still is a giant lake in Africa, bigger than entire counties in Ireland, for example, which is kind of insane. They explored the Niger and Senegal rivers, and they had a few western expeditions along the coast, and these gave them some more info on like shipping routes and the general makeup of the coast, if they could have ships coming alongside it, if they could set up maybe some coastal bases. And so all in all, it was fairly successful, I would say, but it is a somewhat unknown and forgotten piece of history, as just the image of a Roman soldier, a Roman legionnaire trekking through southern Africa is honestly not something I expected from this iceberg. Lead poisoning. So lead is a great metal, and the Romans thought so too, and they would use it in everything from coins to weapons to decorations and trinkets to even piping and cooking pots and utensils. And one added bonus about lead is that when you used it in certain foods, in certain forms of cooking, it tended to impart quite a tangy, sweet flavor, while the copper and bronze pots tended to leave somewhat of a bitter flavor. And so the rich people in society tended to prefer cooking in lead stuff over really any other form of metal. And I should warn you here, another public service announcement by Connor, that if you are thinking of trying this at home, absolutely do not. Lead can and is highly poisonous, and it can lead to a slow and gradual deterioration of the mind, leading to brain damage, to an increased risk of certain diseases. So much so that we can actually determine the wealth status of some of these ancient Roman citizens based solely on the levels of lead inside of their body, because the richer people tended to use lead more, which led to more poisoning, which is still in their skeletons to this day. And actually, our modern society profession that deals with pipes and deals with water and taps, etc., as you all know, is called a plumber. And this comes from the Latin word for lead being plumbus, which should just show you how much the Romans liked lead, especially for stuff like piping. Renovatio Imperii, or the renewal or renovation of the empire. And this was a phrase used during the empire. You know, it was said in public, it was put onto coins, it was written down, and it was used both in terms of like after you had this crazy event, maybe a small civil war or a giant regular war or some sort of civil unrest. This phrase would often be used of, you know, bringing us back to normality, but it would also be used in a more wider sense in terms of bringing Rome back to how it used to be. You know, things have gotten so bad over the last 200 years that we need to go back to the good old days, you know, renovate Rome. And this phrase was also used in later years, often around the medieval period, by people like Charlemagne and Otto III, as well as people like Louis the Pious and Charles the Bald, which that is a hell of a moniker, but it was used by these more modern people to kind of legitimize their rule and tie them in some way to this ancient Roman Empire, to say like, we're not foreign invaders, we are the new Roman Empire, and we want to bring the country or Europe or what have you back to those ideals. So it is a very interesting motto. What's a motto? Nothing. What's a motto with you? Yeah. Flavius Stilicho was a very interesting character. He was a man both of Roman descent and barbarian descent, more specifically of Vandal origins. And he entered the Roman army at a very young age, slowly worked his way up, and eventually became one of the most powerful men, if not the most powerful man, in the entire Roman Empire. He served under Emperor Theodosius I, and he was a fantastic strategist. He was a great military leader and diplomat, and he successfully negotiated a peace between Armenia and Rome and Persia without a single fight. So Theodosius kind of rewarded him with an elevated position in the political landscape and allowed him to marry Theodosius's niece, meaning that Flavius Stilicho now had a familial connection with the royalty, or since this wasn't a monarchy, he now had a connection with the powerful, rich, and ruling class. But he was still half barbarian, and that is something that the Senate generally didn't like. They never really got past this, and so they really weren't looking to have him as their emperor. But Flavius had many successful campaigns in Britannia, in Europe, and with the eventual death of Theodosius, the empire was left to the two sons of Theodosius, Arcadius and Honorius. And since Honorius was only 10 years old at the time, Flavius Stilicho was named his guardian, and so he would serve as regent until Honorius was old enough. And so with Flavius serving as regent, he betrothed his own daughter Maria to Honorius, trying to get hopefully his own bloodline into the succession. But long story short, as I said, the rich people and the Senate kind of disliked him, at least in part due to him just being half barbarian. And even though he was fantastic at battles, he was honestly one of the best, at least at the time, he lost 1 or 2 battles. And after Arcadius in the east, Honorius's brother, Arcadius died, Flavius went from the west over to the east to try and secure the eastern side of the empire, and he was apparently securing it for Honorius, as he was serving as regent after all. But the Senate said that he was marching over there to try and secure the entire empire for himself, and so they charged him with treason and they sentenced him to death. He was captured and executed shortly after this, as was his wife, as were all of his children, including Maria, the one that was betrothed to Honorius. And after his execution, his body was left unburied outside of the city of Rome and just left there to rot, basically humiliating his memory and honor and sending a political message, which I guess is don't mess with the Senate. And with his death came the loss of a great military mind, and the barbarian attacks continued, and eventually Western Rome fell. And this whole series of events is seen as a major turning point in the success or collapse of Western Rome. Consentus, or the harmonious gods, are the 12 gods of the Romans that are listed here. And this isn't a complete list of Roman gods, as there are many more that appear either before or after them, like for example Janus or Vesta, and there are some simply more generic gods, which are seen maybe closer to spirits than gods, like forest spirits or river spirits. But sometime after the 3rd century BC, these 12 gods emerged as the kind of Roman pantheon, or its official array or family of gods. And the topic of gods and belief and religions, etc. at the time was honestly a little bit messy. The old gods of Rome were likely a bit different, and they were seen as more specific gods, perhaps, like the god of the Mississippi River. So perhaps this village has like a god of this particular lake or something, and then the god of the fields on the west side of the mountains. And they also believed in certain spirits, certain maybe animal spirits, and it was really the Greeks that were more interested in these myths and tales and legends and stories. Like the Romans didn't really have that architecture, that framework built, which obviously in part explains why they kind of transmuted it from the Greeks, with, as you likely know, a lot of the main Greek gods being kind of converted into Roman gods. And the number 12 in the Mediterranean in the Middle East around this time seemed to be quite an important number. You had the Etruscans, who had 12 main gods, and the Etruscans were a civilization, a people based in Italy even before the Romans. You also have the 12 Hittite gods of the underworld, and you have the 12 disciples and the 12 gods of Egypt and the 12 Olympians, but it's just to show you that the number 12 was very significant at the time, which explains why they chose this number of Roman gods. The Anastasian Wall was another defensive wall built in Turkey, not Britain, in around the 5th century by the Eastern Roman Empire. And once again, it was roughly the same height as Hadrian's Wall, roughly roughly the same width, but somewhat shorter. And it was built with towers, with forts, with gates, etc., and was really used to protect Constantinople, as they were being attacked by Huns and Slavs and Bulgarians. And today, not much really of the wall remains, but if it's taught us anything, it's that if you have an enemy, just build a wall. The donation of Constantine was a now known to be fake document that was basically apparently written by Emperor Constantine, saying, yeah, I give over Rome, I give all of the land and control and everything over to the Pope. And at the time, especially the 13th century, this was used to kind of justify the Pope's rule, to bolster his credibility. And the Pope said, like, look, this is from the Emperor. I mean, I don't even want all of these lands and money and control and power. The Emperor said to give it to me. But this was later, as I said, proven to be a forgery, made probably sometime in the 8th to 9th century, and not in the 4th century when Emperor Constantine was actually alive. Tier 6, Flavius Aetius, is once again an interesting figure, and he has often been described as the last of the Romans, which a few people have been called over the years, and these are figures that are said to kind of embody the spirit of Rome, you know, whether that's the Roman strength or upholding the Roman system or something like that. These are, for example, Gaius Cassius Longinus, who orchestrated the plot to assassinate Julius Caesar. He's been called the last Roman. Or Gaius Asinius Pollio, said to be one of the last great writers of Rome. But Aetius, I think, deserves this title or moniker more than anyone. And as we covered Flavius Stilicho, you know, the half-Roman, half-barbarian general who defended Western Rome against the barbarian tribes and then was later put to death, well, shortly after this event, a man named Flavius Aetius emerged, and he was a great general, he was a great politician, and he did a fantastic job of defending Roman Gaul from these invaders, from these barbarian attacks, rallied a bunch of different tribes and peoples together to form like a united defense against Attila and the Huns. And for all of this work, he was rewarded with being assassinated by the Roman Emperor Valentinian III. And this was, I think, because he was jealous of Flavius, he was envious, he saw him as quite a powerful figure, and so maybe he was a threat to Valentinian III's rule. And then Valentinian was later assassinated as revenge for him killing Flavius. And it was only 20 years after this that the barbarian Visigoths would defeat Rome, marking the official end of the Western Roman Empire. The donation of Pepin is really quite an interesting entry, and it leads into the history and origin of the Vatican City, which is, you know, this tiny, odd little country within the city of Rome, and is actually the smallest country in the world. But the donation of Pepin, and we won't get too much into the history of these empires, as that would take up an entire video, but basically, the Pope was in Rome, and the Lombards were a tribe that originally came from probably northern Europe, and so they had migrated down. They were kind of in northern Italy, and they were at the time slowly taking over Italy. So Pepin the Short, the king of the Frank kingdom, he himself had been growing in size over the years, and he also had a great deal of respect for the Pope and for Christianity. So he decided to basically fight in the defense of Italy, in the defense of the Pope, and so him and his Frank kingdom defeated the Lombards and then gave a bunch of this land over to the Pope as sort of a donation, and this was the donation of Pepin. And these lands that were now controlled by the Pope, these were called the Papal States. Now, as we mentioned in a previous entry, all the way back in the year 270, these great walls were built around Rome to defend against the invading barbarians, and these were known as the Aurelian Walls. And obviously, since the building of these walls, the city of Rome had grown a little bit, had changed a little bit, and some things were built outside of these walls. And one of these buildings was St. Peter's Basilica, which was a very important building to the Pope and to the church. And it had in the past and at the time been constantly raided and attacked by these Muslim invaders. And so the Pope decided to build an extra wall. So they kind of connected up the Aurelian walls, and they built this extra thing going around the kind of Pope area, you know, St. Peter's Basilica, and it just went over, around, kind of down, went around a few more things, and these are what became known as the Leonine Walls. Then, fast forward hundreds of years later, and in the 1800s, there is a push for the reunification of Italy. As you can see, it's kind of divided up. It's kind of a bit messy. You have Italy here, the Papal States here. It all looks honestly a bit silly. And so Italy eventually succeeds in annexing the Papal States. You know, annexing basically meaning taking. So all of this area no longer belongs to the Pope. It all belongs to Italy. And this includes, by the way, the city of Rome. But the Pope and all of his elite Pope Secret Service, they were all holed up in the Vatican City, and the Pope didn't so much mind his land being taken. I mean, obviously he did, but he really didn't want to be forced to be a citizen of Italy. And so the whole thing was kind of brushed aside. It was kind of ignored and delayed until the dictator Mussolini came into power, and he, perhaps in an attempt to gain favor with the church, with the Pope, with maybe the Italian people, he said that in his dictatorship, he said that he would not take over Vatican City, and he would actually declare it its own country so that the Pope could live there, he could rule things in that area, and importantly, he wouldn't need to be a citizen of Italy. And the area of Vatican City, as you can see from these images, is actually smaller than the original area, you know, walled off. And this is the current modern area of Vatican City, which is kind of insane when you think that it's a country within a city within a country. Roman Caledonia. So Caledonia was the name, more or less, that the Romans used for Scotland. And as we all know, Rome didn't really have any serious success in conquering Scotland. As, you know, they tried, they pushed up north, they kind of failed for a while, they built the Hadrian's Wall, and then they built Antonine's Wall, and then that ended up failing, and they had to come back to Hadrian's Wall. And I think it was at that point that they just kind of gave up and was like, all right, you can have the north. And so Scotland remained free from Roman control and more or less free from Roman influence. The name is thought to have derived from the Caledoni tribe, which was one of the tribes in the area at the time, but that's about as far as this entry goes. The Republic of the Romans, 8th century. So this is just a minor entry referencing a comment that Pope Stephen made, and this was in the year 754 AD, and it was directed at Pepin the Short, saying that he would support the suit of St. Peter and the Republic of the Romans. Now, as we all know, the Roman Republic fell in the year 27 BC, some 700 to 800 years before this comment was made. And so this has kind of bolstered the idea that a lot of people, especially at the time, they still saw Rome as the Roman Republic and not the Roman Empire. And this has kind of confirmed the theory with some people, saying that even though it transformed from a republic into an empire, that even this empire wasn't really an empire, but it was like an empire-flavored republic. You know, you still had the rich people, you still had the Senate, and even back in the kingdom, the Senate still had power, they still voted the individual kings into power, and so this argument says that basically the Senate stays solid throughout the entirety of Rome, and while it maybe had slightly less power in the kingdom and then lost some power in the empire, the theory is that Rome never stopped being a republic and it was just an empire in name only. Tier 7, O Tempura, O Moras. And I think I said tempura, not tempora, which is a completely different delicious thing. But O Tempora, O Moras is a Latin phrase meaning "Oh the times, oh the customs." And it was basically used the same way we use certain phrases. Like, you know, the country's going to the dogs, or the country's going down the tubes, if you're a mafia boss. And is basically meant as a criticism of the times and the customs that that person is living in. And it was used most famously, I think, by the Roman consul Cicero, or Kikiro, which makes it sound Japanese. Roman consul Kikiro. But this was in a speech that Kikiro gave, and it was directed at his political enemy, Catiline. And Catiline basically tried to coup Rome. He led an army into Rome. He even tried to kill the consul Kikiro himself, and tried to destroy parts of Rome, tried to seize power for himself, and even after he was stopped and he was captured, he still wasn't put to death. And this is what Kikiro was complaining about. He was saying, like, typical. In this time, in this culture, we're letting him get away with this. Like back in the good old days, you know, classic Roman times, the Senate would have instantly voted to put him to death. But it is kind of interesting to see these sayings, and shows that sometimes some things never change. The Roman Empire abolished 1922, and this comes from a theory that says that after the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, was taken over by the Ottomans, after this takeover, the Ottomans basically became the new Roman Empire. And so, with the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1922, this also spelled the official end of the Roman Empire. And I think personally, it's not too solid of a theory. You know, there was a wide range of reasons, I think, why the Ottoman Empire wasn't really compatible with the Roman Empire. Like, yes, they took over the Eastern Roman lands. There were also some similarities in how they took taxes, in the religious freedom they allowed within their empire, and with their ruler, Mehmet II, being given the title Kaiser or Caesar I Rum, or the Caesar or leader of Rome. But I think these similarities are somewhat superficial, and the people in the Roman Empire at the time, they saw themselves overwhelmingly as Christian, and obviously the Ottoman Turks were Muslim. And additionally, the Ottomans were seen as invaders coming into Rome, taking it by force, rather than being a part of Rome and changing Rome from the inside, you know, more organically. And this idea of the Roman Empire not ending in the 1400s, but carrying on, continuing through some other population, through some other culture or civilization, this is not really a new theory. And it brings up the question of what exactly Rome or the Roman Empire was. Was it a region? Was it a religion or a culture or a nationality or an area or political system? Russia has laid claim to being an extension of the Roman Empire through, for example, the Orthodox Church and the Byzantine cultural influences. The Ottomans laid claim to being the Roman Empire through obviously taken over the land, taken over the institutions of Eastern Rome. The Holy Roman Empire has laid claims through, you know, religious means and through European influence, through Christianity and authority. And Spain has at some points said that they are a continuation of the Roman Empire through legal means and inheritance, with apparently a bunch of the Roman Empire legally being left to Spain. So people have brought up, I think, quite valid points that for a system as huge and complex as the Roman Empire, it's kind of hard to determine or see what a continuation would look like. And in my opinion, I think once you get outsiders coming in and taking it over swiftly, I think that ceases to be a continuation. And the only way I think you can change an empire is if you get mass migration into it, both in terms of, you know, people, ethnicities, cultures, ideas, and from the inside, the empire itself slowly changes over time. The Romans had knowledge of Iceland is a very interesting entry. And while the Romans didn't explicitly explore kind of this sort of area, you know, Norway, Finland, Iceland, etc., they did learn about Iceland and its existence from the same Greek traveler and explorer that discovered and named Ireland. And in Pytheas the Explorer's book on the ocean, he describes a land to the far north that he calls Thule. And Thule is widely thought to be Iceland. And the whole story is pretty interesting. Pytheas with the Greeks sailed up here in around 300 to 400 BC. So he sailed out of the Mediterranean, he sailed all up around, you know, England and Ireland and Scotland, and he likely went as far north as the Nordic nations. But the Romans, even after 1,000 years, they never ever sailed up or explored this far. And that was partly because Pytheas was just a fantastic navigator. Like, he was incredible. And also the sailing and naval technology, you know, the ships, the boats, etc. They were far more advanced for the Greeks than the Romans. But also, the Romans didn't really care for it. After the Punic Wars, they had ships that would kind of sail them around the Mediterranean. And from the Mediterranean, they were able to access Europe and Africa and the Middle East, and they didn't really have a want or need to explore any further. Yes, as we learned, they did go to sub-Saharan Africa, but it was hard to push up into the Eastern European parts of Europe, and if they didn't see a need in traveling to Ireland, they sure as heck weren't going to go to Iceland. But they did, as we said, at least have knowledge of it, which I think is incredibly fascinating. Diocletian fake news. So this is a reference to the Emperor Diocletian, and we covered him a little before, but he kind of came into power. He made some governmental reforms. He formed the Tetrarchy, which kind of split the empire into these 4 rulers, and these were 2 major rulers with 2 minor rulers below them. And this system of 2 rulers of the empire kind of more closely mirrored the structure of the republic before them. But he also, in an attempt to kind of make this all go over quite smoothly, to make sure there weren't any hitches, he kind of put out an early form of government propaganda. And while I think propaganda was probably going on for, you know, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, people have always lied. This is one of the earliest and most extreme examples of it that we can see in the records. So the Tetrarchs, you know, the new rulers, they were kind of seen as the restorers of the empire. Achievements made by recent rulers were basically deleted from the record, and this scene was painted, this picture was painted of Rome before the Tetrarchy was founded as being just pure chaos. They changed records and events to say, okay, before we came into power, it was just chaos and crime and civil wars and everything. Anything good that happened before them, it was either just deleted entirely from the record, or it was pushed even further back so that the good stuff happened not 10 years ago or 15 years ago, but actually it happened 115 years ago. And all of this time in the middle, they painted as sheer mayhem and pure chaos. And so they just rewrote recent history. Like, these were things that were taking place right here and now, or at least incredibly recently. And it was, as we would call it, fake news. And it's partly comforting, partly worrying to see that some things apparently never change. Tier 8, Romulus and Remus never existed. And honestly, this isn't too bad of a theory. We do know a lot less about the Roman kingdom than maybe we would like to know. And this is firstly because there weren't a huge amount of records kept in the first place. You know, about the founding of Rome, about its early years, and even a lot of the later years. And whatever records were kept, a lot of them were destroyed in the sack of Rome by the Gauls in the year 390 BC. And this was somewhat of an interesting event where the Gauls were at war with Rome. Rome ended up losing quite a devastating battle to the Gauls, and after this the Gauls marched straight into Rome and it was basically empty. There were no guards in Rome, there was no one manning the walls or the towers, and so the Gauls actually suspected that this was part of a trap. They were like, how can you leave your main city just completely undefended? And so they camped outside of Rome and didn't enter it for an entire 2 days. Whilst in reality, it was literally just left unguarded because they sent so many of their army, their military out to fight the Gauls. And when they lost, the few people that they did have either fled Rome or hunkered down in the inside of the city. And so no one was left to defend the gates or the walls or the city itself. Rome put the entirety of its main fighting force, you know, that wasn't sent off to fight the Gauls, they all gathered on Capitol Hill. And from there, they were basically able to fight off the Gaul attackers, which honestly wasn't worth much because the Gauls had already taken Rome. But eventually, after the Gauls destroyed a bunch of buildings, they took everything they could carry, they burnt what they couldn't carry. They eventually agreed to leave Rome for a fee of 1,000 pounds of gold. And that's 1,000 pounds in weight, not in British currency, because the British pound didn't exist in 390 BC. The more you know. And Rome basically paid them, the Gauls left, but Rome was severely crippled. And this defeat of the Romans by the Gauls is thought to be one of the most devastating defeats that the Romans ever faced. And it was always kept in mind by the Romans as this could potentially happen again. So, did Romulus and Remus ever exist? Did they partly exist? Were they kind of based on another tale or another myth or another actual person or people? I mean, it's honestly a little hard to say. Agnostos Theos was the Christian god all along. Now, this is a super interesting part about the Roman pantheon, and that is that as well as the 12 main Roman gods, there were also a few other minor gods and deities and spirits, etc. And there was this Greek deity or deities that were simply known as Agnostos Theos, or the unknown god or gods. And this was like an actual thing. There were altars to the Agnostos Theos. I'm sure some people said prayers to them and made offerings to them, etc. But way back in the day, when Paul the Apostle came to Athens, he came to speak, he came to preach about Christianity and Christ, etc. And he said to them, like, look, I know you are all incredibly religious people. I know you take religion very seriously. And you even, I saw, had an altar to the unknown god. Well, he said, let me tell you here that this god you worship as the unknown god, I worship as the one true God. You know, the God of Christianity that created everything, etc. And then he goes on to preach about Christ and Christianity, spread the word sort of thing. And it's an interesting theory, maybe closer to headcanon theory, that the Greeks actually knew about the existence of Yahweh, maybe even before Christ. And I know they knew about Jewish people at the time, and the Jews obviously believed in Yahweh, and that's why I said maybe this is like a headcanon sort of thing. So if you imagine that all of these gods actually exist, and Yahweh, the same God that perhaps spoke to Abraham and Moses, Yahweh came down, maybe he spoke to the Greeks, and instead of worshipping him and following him like the Jewish people did, instead they said, oh yeah, this one God spoke to me, didn't really care to learn more about him or his rules or his name or anything. We're just gonna put him down as an unknown god. Or maybe Yahweh tried to communicate with many people over the years. You know, maybe he went and spoke with the Africans, they didn't really like his message, so then he left and he went and spoke with the Greeks, and then he thought, no, you know, the Greek people, they're not really believing me, they're not following my message devoutly enough, and so then he left and went to the Middle East, to the Mediterranean. So maybe the Greeks didn't know enough about Yahweh, but they did know about his existence, therefore unknown god. Aeolism, that Latin was a Greek dialect. So this is a theory that Latin was basically just a branching off of Greek, and that these two languages go quite far back, but that Greek was the original timeline in a way. And when people migrated from Greece over to the Italian peninsula, and then went on to, you know, start Rome and start these other Latin cities, that all of these people and this language came originally from Greece. And it should be noted that this theory isn't at all accepted, at least not widely, in today's world. So from a historical, academic perspective, this doesn't really hold much weight, but historically, it was quite a popular theory. And I think that's because around the time of Rome and the Roman Republic, the Roman Empire, etc., they often had a great deal of respect for Greece, for Greek academics and science and beauty and arts and architecture, etc. So the idea of the Latin language coming from Greece, it was more kind of like a compliment, I would think, saying that this Latin language has roots in divinity. But yeah, as I said, very likely not true, but it is a theory regardless. The Minoan eruption caused the founding of Rome. So this is a kind of a niche theory that connects the Minoan eruption, this giant volcanic eruption that actually destroyed most of the Santorini island in around 1600 BC. It connects that to the founding of Rome, because with this eruption came the destruction of many people, of communities and culture and farmlands, etc. And this theory says that after this eruption, a lot of areas and peoples were destroyed, which in turn led to mass migration by these people to many different areas, but one area of which was northern Italy, which led to Romulus and Rome and the Roman Kingdom and Republic and Empire, etc. All of this from the Minoan eruption. Now, there isn't a whole load of evidence for this. The popular consensus nowadays is that the Roman ancestors, the people who migrated down into Rome or into northern Italy and founded Rome, they probably came from like Middle Europe sort of region. So think of Germany, France, that sort of area. But this is still a theory, maybe not a good theory, but it is a theory nonetheless. Byzantine aviation refers to a very interesting letter which was written in the 1400s, where a high up Roman official mentions seeing flying machines being tested in Laconia, this area of Greece. And granted, they weren't successful because we obviously didn't invent flying until like the 1900s. But it is super interesting to see that they were at least successful in his eyes. And so they were perhaps maybe able to, glide a little bit, or instead of flying, they were perhaps falling with style. And later on, one of this man's students was a man you might have heard of, Leonardo da Vinci, who of course is famous for, among other things, his incredible flying machine designs. So it is an incredible little piece of history, I think. And it's crazy that it took 500 or more years to go from this, successful flying attempts. So probably a bit of gliding, a bit of 500 years to go from that to actual flying. And then just 60 years after that, we were flying rockets into space and landing men on moons, or moon singular. And now we have AI sex bots and solar-powered panini makers. Oh, the times. And there are also accounts going back as far as the 12th or even 10th century of various other attempts to fly, like for example what was described as a Turk jumping off a pillar in Constantinople with some sort of a winged contraption trying to fly, which he didn't. He fell to his death. So people have been trying it for a very, very long time. And that is all we have time for. The last and final and deepest part of this iceberg will be coming very shortly, and it will cover the deepest, darkest, most strange, unknown, and curious entries of this iceberg that you will honestly not want to miss. Hit the subscribe button and bell icon if you want to be notified of it when I release it. And as always, thanks for watching.